Hi, everyone. So we'll get started now. I'd just like to take a moment to welcome everyone to this informational meeting for naming, understanding, and playing with metaphors in music. My name is Dylan Robinson. I don't know everyone here in the room, but it's lovely to see so many folks here. This is a informational meeting about this publication project. I am one of 4 of this editorial quartet, as we are calling it, that also includes Sun Eidsheim, Martin Daughtry, and Danny Walden. And so we have a bit of information that we'd like to start and provide you with. But just to begin, I'd like to also welcome by saying Eiswell al CMCIAT, Ilal Talsquich, Tlitzel Quat Squa, Chitzalatzel to Humakquim Hormak Equala. And that is the welcome that we give here on the west coast of the nation state called Canada, but in Musqueam territory. And as is sometimes the practice, as I've noticed in Zoom, you're welcome to also include in the chat where you're joining us from, whose lands you're gathering, you're joining us from in this moment, if you'd like to do that. I know it's a complicated question for some of those folks who are not from places indigenous lands. It's a big question, but please feel free to add that information if you'd like. And I think without saying much, well, I will say that I am the most recent addition to this editorial group. And I'm really excited about this publication for many reasons, but one of which is my interest in writing, my interest in writing about music and how we convey information about musical experience and sensory experience of sound. And metaphor is one of the ways that we do that expansively. And so it's really exciting to me to be involved in this project, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. And so without saying anything more at this point, I will pass it over to Nina, who will discuss the background to the project.
Thank you so much, Dylan. We're so happy that you have joined us. And before I do go on to talk a little bit more specifically about the volume, I'll just give Martin and Danny a chance to say hi. I'll just start out by saying, again, my name is Nina Eidsheim. I am a professor of musicology at UCLA and the founder and director of the UCLA Peer Lab, the practice-based experimental epistemology research lab. I guess I should remove your spotlight now. Sorry. And of the Peer Lab, yes. And this metaphor project is one of the big efforts of the Peer Lab, and we'll talk more about that later. I'll hand it over to Martin, just to introduce yourself briefly, and then Danny.
Hi, everybody. I'm Martin Daughtry. I teach at New York University and am a proud purveyor of metaphors and metaphor aficionado and member of the editorial quartet. Very happy to see you all here.
And I'm Danny Walden. I'm calling in from Durham University, which is where I teach music theory and analysis. Also a metaphor enthusiast. Nice to see you all here, many familiar faces as well.
Yes, it's great to see you. Danny, I think I'm going to spotlight you and me because I think we're going to maybe be team tagging between what we're doing right now.
That's great.
Let me see, add spotlight. I think that's it. Okay, all right.
And so, maybe before you two get started, we'll just let everyone know that we're going to give you some kind of general information about the volume and then open it up for questions and bouncing around of ideas from all of you. So please stay tuned for that at the end.
Yes, and the other little piece of very practical information that I'll share is that we're recording this session, which you know, but we will be posting this session on the Peer Lab YouTube channel because a lot of people aren't able to be here. So if you don't want your face to be on, I think the video will mainly be on the people who are talking, but if you don't want to be sort of present at all in that video, you can take your name off the space where your name is and just mute your camera. Or if you have any concerns, you can also just contact us. All right. So as Martin said, there are lots of familiar faces here. Many of them are friends and colleagues, of course, but there are also people who shared this space with Danny and myself and many others at the spring spring symposium around metaphors and music. So we have really, we're really in the middle of this conversation, and the volume is one of the ways that we want to talk together about the ways that metaphors are really shaping the way that we think, that we feel, that we practice music. Danny, just move in anytime. You and I are like
Sure.
twins now at this point.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we're interested in metaphors in music, metaphors as they're used in music discourse, and drawing greater attention to the ways that they're structuring how we think about music, how we understand it. But there are a number of other issues that we're interested in, and then we're hoping in opening up this volume to ideally so many contributors that we can gain a lot of different perspectives on. And one of those things is, oh, sorry, Nina, go ahead.
I just was going to give you some information, more information about the symposium. If there are many people are participating here on the call now who gave papers or introduced people, shared panels, and you can see the documentation on this link. And we also are very concerned with, which is actually what this whole metaphor project is about, really, is to listening into how we talk about, think about, and perform and listen to music. So part of that is every time we do something, we try to spend a lot of time paying attention to what it is that we did. So we created something that we call a care package, which shows you how we listened to each other. We had 4 poets whose job was just to participate and listen to the entire symposium, and you'll see some of their poetry in response to the symposium. So I just want you to get the kind of a feeling of the ethos of the work we're doing in those 2 recent links. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, another thing you'll see in that link is that in the symposium, we've sort of been working with the idea. And what we're doing here is we're naming and we're understanding and playing with metaphors. And maybe just to explain a little bit about that, which I think is in some ways a helpful way of understanding this project, naming and understanding and maybe playing with this project. Right. So when we're talking about naming metaphors, what we're interested in is identifying these kinds of metaphors, which are part of our discourse about music, some of which we may be aware of as sort of a rhetorical device, some of which we may not be so aware of. Metaphors that are sort of deep into the language, that are almost naturalized to the extent that we don't see them. As when we talk about a pitch that's high or a pitch that's low, we're semi-aware so often of this being a metaphor, right, for understanding how musical sound, how musical pitch works. But it's a metaphor that's doing that work. And so bringing these metaphors to light is something we're interested in. But also we see metaphors as something that operate not just in language, but something that's part of our embodied experience, right? So the kinds of metaphorical associations that we make between music and other aspects of life or our universe, there's something that's reflected also in our embodied experience, how we move through that world, and in our architecture, in our physical surroundings, etc. So we're thinking of metaphor not just as a literary device or as a sort of something that we always see in words, but something that's also part of our environment, of our embodied experience, etc. Sorry, Nina, I saw you wanted to add something.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. So if just to pick up on the example you gave, for example, a high pitch or high note, and you often see people moving upward when they're even thinking about that or listening to that, or especially performing it. So one of the reasons we're so interested in metaphors is because it creates rules and ways for the body to live in the world. So for instance, to strain or to reach upwards, and it also creates relationship between people. So we want to be aware of the kinds of metaphors that we are reinvigorating each time we use them, whether we are aware of them or not. Do we want to give them?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was so a little bit more. So we talked about naming a little bit, understanding and playing, just to sort of address what we mean by that quickly. So, you know, this process of identifying is in many ways what we see as a starting point. We're interested in doing the kind of work, analytical work or critical work, creative work also, that helps us understand more these metaphors and their entailments, right? Once we recognize the kind of work that this metaphor is doing in shaping how we conceive or understand music, following, okay, if we understand it that way, what does that mean also about how we understand, you know, the thing that that metaphor is establishing a link with? And then following these kinds of links to understand a little bit more this sort of conceptual world that we're building for ourselves through metaphor, and denaturalizing that world is another very important part of this work. And then the final part, play. I mean, we're very much interested in creative practice, creative work that can help us understand these metaphors, but also play with them in new and creative ways. So if we understand that a metaphor is doing a particular kind of thing, sometimes harmful, say, in sort of shaping a misconception of what, say, musical practice or musical culture is about. Playing with those metaphors, because they're out and about us, playing with them and recontextualizing them, giving them new meaning, new sort of outlets, is something that's also a really important part of this project, and that we would love to see creative writing, which maybe Dylan will talk about a little bit at some point later. But this sort of creative exercise with metaphors is a really valuable part of this project. So we see these kinds of you know, possible contributions as tapping into any of these different aspects, 1, 2, or 3 of them, naming, understanding, and playing from a variety of different perspectives. So that's a little bit, I think, of a general overview. And Nina, anything else to add that you can think of?
I think it might come up later. We'll weave it in later. Yeah.
I would just quickly add that within the concept of play that we're working with, proposing a new metaphor that is not yet a part of music discourse is totally works according to our rules. You know, so that's something that that we would welcome. So there are a number of, you know, different trajectories that contributors can kind of travel to get into the meat of the volume.
And we have had some questions about, like, what is a metaphor in music? And to me, in a way, any word that we use when we describe or think about music, it is metaphorical. Signal, volume, speed, tempo, form. I can't think of any word that isn't at some level metaphorical. So I think for anybody, it's a good exercise to really look at each word we use and each concept we use when we think about music. So I think this is a time when we leave the spotlight, Danny and I, and we keep it on Martin, who's going to talk a bit more about the specifics.
Right.
Is that?
Yeah, that's fine. So as Nina said, you know, it's a kind of a mind-bending activity to begin reflecting on the metaphoricity of music discourse or of language more generally, and you very quickly get to a point where you know, you know, of almost inarticulateness, because you know, as I'm speaking right now, I'm reflecting, he said, using metaphor, like I'm like all of these, there's this endless proliferation of scare quotes that go on as you begin realizing how much kind of movement from one conceptual domain to another, just the simplest term or sentence kind of contains within it. So that's a kind of a vertiginous, the vertiginous environment within which we're all operating. And with that in mind, I think that's one of the reasons that we have decided to, within a very elastic conception of the kinds of essays that we are hoping to bring into the volume, that we have set up a few pretty rigid parameters so that we don't all spin off into the infinity of metaphor. And the principle, the strictest parameter that we've set up is one that has to do with length of contributions. So there's going to be a strict 2,000 word what do you call it? Not deadline, 2,000 word limit.
Word count.
Yeah, word count. That is the maximum number of words that you will be able to use if you're in the volume. We think that in addition to kind of helping people contain their energies and ideas and giving them a kind of a tight vessel within which to be creative, that this will also make it difficult for all of us to engage in some of the kind of conventional moves of academic prose that might make an essay less accessible to a wider audience. So I think 2,000 words will limit the amount of jargon and intertextuality that the essays contain, which is not to say that we're interested in eliminating those things, but just in kind of keeping a very broad shared aesthetic for the volume that values clarity and that values I guess that values poetics, right? Because within that tight frame, you're going to need to kind of think about the placement of every word, and that's something that we're hoping to engender within the volume. This leads into, I guess, a necessary consideration of our anticipated community of readers, and we're hoping that that community of readers will be really, really broad. One thing that we imagine people doing with this, a large volume with several dozen short essays in it is, I could imagine an introductory music theory class stringing together a constellation of essays that they turn to and return to over the course of a semester. I could imagine that taking place in a high school classroom. I could imagine that a stringing together of metaphors undergirding a creative project or a series of compositions. So while the volume is, I guess you could say it is an academic volume, and we want it to be contributive to and taken seriously by the academic communities that the four of us and many, if not all of you, are embedded in and participating in. We also have our sights kind of on a more expansive horizon, I guess, and so that's something that we will hope to be in communication with the people who contribute to the volume, that will kind of talk not just about the particular metaphor that your essay focuses on, but that will be in the greater community of this edited volume, discussing poetics and discussing style, in addition to working out issues of substance.
I might just jump in here, Martin, to pick up a little bit on the poetics and approach aspect that you were talking about. one of the things that I think is really interesting about this short format, it's it does, as you say, require a different approach to writing. And while we might at some, if we're thinking, yesterday we were talking about the volume a little bit, and Nina mentioned the leap as a way that we might, for example, describe an aspect of a piece. It leaps here, right, or whatever. And so, while an approach might typically be to think about the leap in as a broader concept within the scope of 2,000 words, talking about many pieces, and that is in a comprehensive way, becomes pretty impossible. But there is still possibilities across different works. And I think also what's really interesting to me is the specificity. When we start thinking from that example, for example, in as just one example of many, we also need to think about particular kinds of embodiment. How is the leap in this piece, in this section of this piece, in relation to how I understand bodies and leaping, and my own body, and how my own body might leap, and how I hear that in that way. So there's a kind of specificity here that I think is really interesting, that also overlaps, of course, with the ways in which we describe that kind of embodiment that we're hearing, or that kind of metaphor that we're hearing in a work. And so writing is always important. It's a core aspect of what we do, but there's room here to think through how different kinds of poetics, and I don't mean creating poetry as the entire contribution to the work, but how the craft of language actually articulates the metaphor, or even perhaps how in a more critical way, if you wanted to look at how metaphor has been used in other writing, how it might leave gaps around our understanding of what a leap is, even through calling it that. So there's a lot of different approaches here, and I'm really excited to see the variety of ways that people will address that through writing, and through the contributions that folks submit. Maybe I'll turn it back now. I'm not sure who's next in this.
Well, I'll just follow on for
Sure.
1 second with a few points of clarification. I see that Nina wrote in the chat. She noted that I neglected to add a graduate seminar as a very logical forum for reading selections from, if not the entirety of the volume that we're putting together. So yes, definitely graduate seminars are on board. The other thing that I would stress is that our idea is that the essays will be focused around a single metaphor, and so that the kind of first move that contributors will make is to identify a metaphor that will kind of sit at the center of the essay, or whatever form your 2,000 words or less ends up taking. With that said, you've probably, I imagine you've all encountered different keyword volumes where there's a single essay devoted to a particular keyword. And we decided early on in this process that we didn't want to do that with this volume. We didn't want to have individual authors stake out specific metaphors and be the only voices weighing in on them. So there's the possibility within the volume that we will collect a small group of essays that take kind of different positions vis-a-vis a single metaphor. So you might find yourself writing in conversation with another person who is writing about the melodic leap, to take the example that Dylan wrote. So that's just a kind of a structural moment within the volume that we needed you to all be aware of.
Great, thank you so much. And let me see, there are a number of things I want to add. In some ways, we have thought about this as a kind of keyword project. It isn't a keyword project in that it's not trying to be comprehensive. We don't have a list of metaphors that we're trying to cover. This is very much a collaboration with this community that has been growing over the last few years, who are interested in looking at the ways that we're conceptualizing music from this kind of particular lens. And each of us have our own music and metaphors or research project that we're doing individually, and that is also informing the kind of editorial lens that we bring to the project. So for instance, Danny and I have been working on this for a few years now, and this is independent from the volume, but we just had our first piece published in the journal Kalfu that George Lipsitz edited. And it's on a very particular botanical metaphor that comes from Danny's archival research. So that's maybe something to look at, to see how we're following a metaphor, how it crosses domains, and how those 2-3 domains are then cross-fed politically and in terms of the way that power is wielded. And if you don't have access to this yourself through your own library access, just write to me and I can send it to you. So that's one example. And we're also really, really interested in creating community. It's not just about these finished pieces. I think number one is an invitation to think together around these topics, this really, really important topic. Thank you, Michelle Kisluk, for the really nice note that you put maybe 10 minutes ago or something, if people are scrolling, on the importance of this work. And we really, really believe in this work. We believe in the political potency of it. And so we're going to be having different ways of getting together as writers, whether you're in the volume or not, and whether you're interested to be in the volume or not, if you just want to be part of this writing community, or if you just want to be part of thinking about this. So that's the other thing, that is very much about the thinking. Not there will be an output for some of us, but it's really, to me, the emphasis is on the thinking and the doing this together. I'm going to go to the timeline now that I'm going to ask Danny to address. And then I see that there are different questions being put in the chat. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to scroll back through all of them. So when we open up for the question answer, maybe you can just restate your question when you get to that point. Although before you start, Danny, I wanted to say one thing that I had promised that I would say, and then I forgot. That this project is being run out of the peer lab, meaning that the peer lab is bringing resources to it. But you're not required to use any of the peer lab methodologies, or you don't have to do experimental research in order to come up with and work through your metaphor. It's more like an administrative and a resource question for us, the people who are involved in doing this work. But you're of course welcome to. But the peer lab has been working really deeply with questions around music and metaphor for 2 years now, and the peer lab put on the symposium that we told you about earlier, and I'll put those links up in the chat again for those who came in after I had shared those links already. So there's a kind of loose, for the people who are participating as writers, is a loose affiliation to the peer lab, but for us who are like in the middle of it, is an important affiliation. All right, I'll hand it over to you, Danny.
Yeah, this will be quick, just a few of the logistical details. So we've asked if you could, if you're interested in contributing, which we very much hope you are, you can submit a letter of interest, and I'll include a link to the form here, and we ask that you can fill out. And this would be by February 1st, so by the beginning of the next month. And on this form, we ask essentially for a short reflection on your experiences with metaphors, an abstract, and then also for a single sentence, which embodies the energy and style of your proposed essay. So really to get at the heart of how you'll be working with language in some ways in that essay. And then after you receive those, we'll be handing out the decisions in the months after. Nina already mentioned that we'll also be holding after this a series of online and potentially in person, depending on interest, workshops and conversations, some just for the writers in order to work on the contributions for the volume, but some also open so we can all be part of this conversation, which will be happening under the auspices of the Peer Lab. And that's it, I think. Last thing I was going to mention was the link, which I already posted. So I think that's all of the logistical details I can think of. But if you have any questions about the timeline or about anything else related to that, please don't hesitate to ask.
So we're hoping to give people feedback within a couple of months. It's more a matter of art. We're going to move as quickly as possible on that. And then there is a later submission deadline for the actual piece. Martin and Dylan, before we go into the Q&A, is there anything else we want to say?
I'll ask a question on behalf of the group. Nina and Danny, you mentioned the essay on botanical metaphors that you are just publishing. I wonder if kind of as another example of the kind of engagement with a metaphor that we're hoping to solicit, could you just describe, you know, a few of the botanical metaphors that you were tracking?
I can do that. I'll do it very quickly, because if you're interested, you can also click on the link and see it there. Essentially, in this piece, Nina and I are thinking through botanical metaphors in particular. So, I mean, many of us will probably be familiar with the way, especially in music analysis and theory, which is, you know, where I come from, botanical metaphors circulate all the time. So it's very common for analysts to talk about the seed or the germ of an idea, which blossoms into the tree, or metaphorical tree of the entire piece, or to talk about a melody which blossoms like a flower and has all of these characteristics, etc. So these are the kinds of metaphors we've seen. Also collections of music, you know, as florilegium. This is a term from Latin that you see in a lot of early music collections. But also somebody pointed out to me that anthology, the word in of itself, means a collection of flowers. So this botanical metaphor that's even at the heart of how we think about collecting or gathering multiple examples of something. And so these botanical metaphors are something we were interested in. And we were talking a little bit about organic metaphors more broadly, which we see them as part of, and how these are very much an example, a sort of quintessential example of those organic metaphors. And there's a really wonderful, rich body of literature that's critiquing, thinking critically about the work that these organic metaphors do in, say, naturalizing certain models of growth, like a teleological model of growth. But what Nina and I also noticed, which was quite striking, is the way that these botanical metaphors get used in a particular body of musical discourse, which is actually what we were looking at in particular is turn of the century writing, American settlers talking about indigenous music in North America. And one thing we notice is that botanical metaphors in that context were doing a very different kind of work. They had a different valence. That these botanical metaphors that were about models of growth and life, in this context, were models were sort of redefined as sort of metaphors of plants that were already dead or were dying out. So, for instance, one common metaphor that we found, instead of it being an anthology or a collection of living flowers, it was like a hortus siccus, an album of dried, pressed flowers, and this being a collection of transcriptions of indigenous song. Or also that in listening to indigenous song, the best way to do it, according to the analyst Alice Fletcher, was to separate the husk from the kernel. So the timbres, the qualities of the songs that she heard, which she found objectionable, if you separated those out and focused just on the pitch content, you found a real melody there, as she expresses it. And these metaphors seem to be doing for us a very different kind of work. And so following those entailments, as you'll see if you read the piece, thinking about what they say about how these analysts are reinforcing a declensionist narrative, one that's reinforcing the idea that Native indigenous ways are doomed to become extinct, with the spread of settler political life. So reinforcing that, but also how it's connected with the ways that settlers were thinking about and working with and also claiming native land, how these metaphors were connected with that. So this is some of the thinking that's in that work. And maybe an example of how one might take a metaphor, in this case, a botanical metaphor, and sort of run with it and follow in different directions, tracing the political work that it does in the world as well. Well, that's a very brief summary, as much as I could make it, but you'll find more information about that in the link that Nina's posted.
Thank you.
All right, so now are we going to move to questions from the group?
Yes. So if you wrote the question earlier that hasn't been answered yet, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can also just unmute yourself and ask the question. But if we didn't answer your question, we didn't see it, so please repost it again. Or just unmute yourself. Everything is crystal clear.
Well, so I have a question, but I ask it sheepishly, having tuned in 25 minutes late. And so if you addressed it, I apologize.
No worries.
I just was curious if you had, and the answer to this might simply be no, if you had a sense of what forms the edited volume will take, specifically if there's any effort to have sort of an online open access approach to its publication or anything along those lines. Again, it may be too early to say, but that was the question that I was left with after reading the proposal, especially.
Yeah, we didn't respond. We didn't address that already, Will. So thank you for asking it. We are in conversation about that. The question of online open access is a question of funds. So we will do our best to make that happen. But yeah, it's a question of funds. And anybody from the group, if you have resources, grants from your own university that help towards that, we would, and you want to collaborate on that, we would of course welcome that. And I think we can talk about the publisher, isn't that right, Martin and Dylan?
Can.
Yeah, so we are in close conversation with Duke University Press, who will be working with us on this volume, and yeah.
Yeah, but I think we are very interested in open access if it's possible, being aware that particularly for scholars in Europe, in order for publications to count toward your professional development, they often need to be open access in order to kind of get you full credit. That in addition to the beauty of an expanded audience for an open access work is clearly something that we care about. So if it's possible, I think we're going to do it. Duke doesn't have any kind of structural commitment to open access publishing, unlike some presses. So that means that we'll need to find money on our own.
Yeah, thank you for that important question, Will. Any other questions in the chat, or just feel free to.
A question from Anna. Oh, a couple questions now have popped up, but maybe we can start with Anna's question, which is, I'll just read it. Can you speak a bit more on what you are looking for in the proposal for a prospective author's personal experience with metaphors? Maybe I'll start answering this to say, I think we're very open to, as I was saying before, a range of approaches, from, it doesn't necessarily need to be, a particular kind of personal experience. It can be, charting things across different pieces, thinking about how others have written about metaphors, particular metaphors, we are really wanting to engage this embodied aspect and sort of how we come to know musical metaphors through our bodies, through our experience. But I don't think we're looking for a really particular kind of approach to that. I think we're pretty open to what you would like to contribute and how you feel most excited to talk about metaphor in relation to your work. Anyone else?
And I would just say, I think another thing that asking potential contributors to talk about their personal experience with metaphors does is it just kind of makes good on our commitment to think about this volume as, you know, one part of the cultivating of a community. So you know, I think you should all feel free to be very conversational, you know, in that in answering that question. You can answer it if your scholarship, you know, does very explicitly and powerfully, you know, single out metaphoricity as, you know, as something that you're investigating, then of course you can talk about that. But, you know, I like, just to give one example, I remember as a kid being told that that by a stranger that my voice was brash, you know, and just like hearing, you know, thinking about like what that meant and all of the kind of this connotative cloud that opened up around me when my own voice was kind of described in that way, gave me a set of feelings about myself that endured over a long period of time. And I would think that, you know, you don't have to be confessional in your mode of address to us by any means, but if you wanted to, you know, talk about your history with metaphors kind of in a more you know, outside your professional life, you know, in your broader life as a sounding, listening, you know, musicking person, that would totally be fine.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just respond to Kendra's question about whether we are primarily interested in metaphors in use by North American/European scholars and or scholarly communities. And we're not limiting it to that, just as a very brief answer. I'll ask Halyar, hi Halyar, to pose her, I believe, question.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for this very exciting initiative. I'm from the University of Oslo, and together with Zafer, and thanks to Zafer for informing me of this exciting initiative. I'm especially intrigued by the inclusions of artistic contributions, and I just wondered if you have considered including some of the founding fathers and mothers. I wish to play with this genealogy metaphor. I'm also intrigued by you pointing out how they often are normative, these metaphors, of cognitive metaphor theory. For instance, Mark Johnson, his most recent book, it's The Aesthetics of Meaning and Thought. He's very much interested in artistic practice, and his wife is a textile artist, so he's also very interested in visual arts, which are one of the bases of his ideas of image schemas in the body and the mind. And to be honest, I think he would be thrilled to contribute, because he has often expressed a wish to combine both theoretical and artistic practice, and also the ethical, the aesthetics of meaning and thought is a sort of theory of everything in the bodily roots of philosophy, science, morality, and art, and he draws a link between all of them. And I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, he's been very important for, of course, work on metaphor generally and music and studies and metaphors. And we are in conversation with a number of people in regards to their potential contribution. So thank you so much for that plug for Mark. I'm sure his ears are, what is it? Itching right now. Hi. Tusen takk, Halyar. And then we'll get Ellen with her question.
Mine's a really boring one, but I wondered, you mentioned, the initial kind of letter of interest, but do you have a ballpark notion of when, if one is accepted, when final papers will be due?
I think we said October.
October 1st.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Other questions?
As we're waiting for other questions to come in, I'll just mention that Lakoff and Johnson, Mark Johnson, wrote a book called Metaphors We Live By in 1980 that's come out in a couple of editions. And I think that volume was one that I think everybody on the editorial team has read and been, I think if one is kind of curious about our general sensibility, taking a look at that volume might be a good idea. It was really something that kind of sparked our conversations early on.
And I think also ties in with this idea of playing with metaphors, thinking about new musical metaphors to live by, or to think with, is really guiding a lot of the work as well.
Yeah.
Great. Which volume? Okay, we can put that in the chat. I have been thinking about this topic for a number of years, and together with the group here, including Ellen, and it's been so rewarding. So I'm very happy that you're all interested in it, and we invite you to, maybe we should put our email address. Do you have that, Danny? The volume address, we can put that in. It's on the call too. We invite
yes,
you
I'll grab it.
Respond to just write to us if you have any additional questions. We'll hang out here for a few more minutes if there are other questions, or if you just want to say hi, and I'll unspotlight us so you can just unmute yourself and say hi, and meet all your fellow friends. Remove spotlight. But I think the official part of the program is finished now. We won't hold you